everyone, and welcome back to season 3 of Commerce Meets Law, a podcast we talk about various commercial topics and how they interact with the legal profession. Today's episode is a super exciting one with Natalie Abou-Alwan, a versatile and commercially orientated general counsel with over 25 years of multi-jurisdictional experience in the project finance, energy, and commodities markets, working in both private practice, investment banks, as well as in-house. Most recently, Natalie was the interim general counsel at the Africa Oil Corporation, mainly advising on M&A projects, and prior to that was the managing counsel at BP, leading their low carbon initiatives. In this episode, we firstly discuss Natalie's journey to becoming a qualified solicitor and how she realized that she wanted to go into the legal profession. We also talk about where her kind of experience and interest for the energy sector sparked from and why she decided that she wanted to specialize in this space, as well as all the experiences that she's gained from working in this space for the last 25 years. Obviously, as we all know, there's been a lot of change, a lot of growth, a lot of regulation in the space over the last 25 years. So understanding it from her perspective, having sort of been on the inside of it for this time, was super interesting and I think will be really insightful for those who want to get into this space. We also talk about, very excitingly, the inspiration behind her new book, How to Navigate Your Career Like a Legend, which was published last summer. I've seen some of the reviews for it and I've flicked through a couple of the pages. I haven't got through all of it yet, but whatever I have seen and all the reviews I've read have been so interesting and mainly kind of really emphasize the fact that it was something that so many people needed to hear and really should have learnt at law school, but perhaps that's not something that we really cover. So I would definitely encourage you to check it out, especially if you enjoy today's conversation, as I'm sure you will. And finally, we talk about her best advice for leaders and young professionals to ensure that workplaces can be places for people to thrive without a sense of fear or judgment. Just a quick request before we get into the conversation. I'd really appreciate if you could kindly give the podcast a follow and a rating on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to these episodes, as it really helps Commerce Meets Law reach more listeners. Without further ado, I really hope you enjoy this episode and I'll see you right at the end. Hi Natalie, and welcome to Commerce Meets Law. Very excited to chat to you about your journey, everything you've done in the last decades of your career, and also get into everything that you champion about your values and especially supporting women in the legal industry as well. But before we get started, we have an icebreaker on the podcast, which is, in your opinion, what is your superpower?
Firstly, thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. And yeah, superpower, I would say, is probably resilience. And that really comes with experience and facing certain challenges.
Yeah, and would you say that's something that you've always had, or is it something you've developed over the course of your career?
I don't think you're sort of born with it. I think you develop it, by some of the situations you're faced with, some of the learnings. And now I can look back on my career and go, God, actually, I could have dealt with that situation so much better, but that's with, 25 years hindsight.
Yeah.
So no, I think it's something you grow into, your resilience, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the more adversities and challenges you face, the more you're able to sort of even see how resilient you really are, because it's all about how
Exactly.
you sort of face those challenges for sure. And in terms of the law, could you tell us a little bit about sort of your interests growing up and when law first came into the picture for you?
Yeah, I never thought I'd be a lawyer. In fact, probably is the last thing I thought I'd be. I wanted to be an actress. I wanted to be on, television,
Huh?
broadcasting. And my mother was actually an actress, and she said, "Well, law is a bit like acting, isn't it?" Which, from standing in court, I can see her point. But yeah, it was sort of a
Yeah.
different type of acting. It was acting without a script, as some barristers describe it. But I studied ancient history, basically, of the Middle East at university, and I didn't even think about law until I sort of got to know some of the lawyers in the college I was at. I was at Oxford University, and the college I was at happened to be very strong in law. I didn't know that at the time. And so listening to some of the discussions of the lawyers who were studying there, I said, God, why didn't I do law? It sounds so interesting. And I thought, well, I don't want to do another 3-year course. And that's when they told me about this conversion course, which a lot of people do. So I did that in London. So that was, way after my my bachelor's degree. So I did the 2-year conversion, got my training contract, and the rest is
Yeah.
history, I guess, from that point.
Yeah, no. Firstly, I think a lot of people who do history actually do end up going into law. I think that that's quite, I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be familiar with that. But
Yeah,
I think equally, that idea of like, at that age, you just don't really know a lot about it. You kind of just go into
yeah.
university and you speak to people and that really can actually open up so many doors. And I guess for you, not really knowing you wanted to do law and then sort of deciding that that was the path, what was your journey like in terms of finding a training contract? Did you sort of face a lot of challenges, or did you find that it was not that much of a challenge at the time?
It was a bit of a mixed bag. So I applied when I was still, I must have been in my final year at university. So I was just studying for finals, etc. And I did
Yeah,
apply to, all the usuals, Clifford Chance, Herbert Smith. I can't remember some of the big ones that were around at the time. And I
yeah,
got rejection letters immediately because I think I wasn't studying law at university at the time. So when I
right.
started my training contract, I thought I'm just going to reapply.
Yeah,
And I did. And I actually got, and in fact, it's the easiest interview I did. It was Clyde and Co. In there, it used to be on Eastcheap in the city in those days. And I went in, had my interview with a partner, and it was just so, just not what I expected. Universities for Oxford were quite tricky and quite tough. So I
yeah.
expected this to be 10 times worse. And actually, it was just like a nice chat. And I left the guy's room thinking, oh, well, obviously I don't have the job then. It was a little bit too simple.
Yeah.
Just before I left the building, I was called back. Reception just said, Natalie, can you please go back up to the partner's room? I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get a dressing down. What's happened? And he was like, we want to offer you a training contract, and here's the contract. Have a read of it. So it was just so quick. I was quite
Wow.
shocked, actually.
Yeah.
But it kind of made me realize that, well, one, persistence can be a good thing. And two, sometimes it's just luck. I clicked with the
Mm.
right partner and I enjoyed my time at Clyde & Co. So I was lucky in that I got a training contract offer very early in my law conversion course studying, because then they paid, I don't know if it's the same now, but they would then pay you for those 2 years.
Yeah.
A few of my cohort struggled a bit, and they're really smart people, and they struggled
Mm.
to find a training contract. So it's a mixed bag, and I don't know if it's the same now. I'm sure it's even more competitive now. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, I think the first part we said was so interesting though, because I think that especially when people are in that sort of stream of applying, a lot of firms, it doesn't go beyond perhaps the website and all they see is like, oh, this vision of that firm. But actually, there's real people working in there, and it's so much about clicking with the right people.
yeah,
As much as it is, of course, about the work and whether those are the sort of seats you want to go into and stuff. But I think that remembering that is really important when you're just, in a sea of looking online at all these really shiny
yeah,
websites and all the rankings and all that kind of stuff. And I think that really shows that even today, even though it's definitely, I would say, a lot more competitive and there's a lot more people applying, but I
yeah,
think that still stands because there's still people who are ultimately sort of, you have to work with when you're there as
exactly.
well. And I guess in terms of sort of your journey when you got to the farm, could you tell us a little bit about sort of the seats you did and, any that you particularly enjoyed or any that surprised you in terms of how much you enjoyed them?
Yeah, I was first put on the corporate floor. I didn't have a desk, I didn't have a chair, I didn't have a telephone in those days. It was landlines. And
Right.
they just sort of forgot about me. So we had like 2 weeks of training, which was excellent training. I still remember some of the lessons they taught us in those first 2 weeks of training at
Wow.
Clyde & Co. Unbeatable. And then I go up to my office, and in those days, most trainees had their own office. I was given to share with somebody, and there was, I was pretty much had to sit on the floor. It was very haphazard. Anyway, eventually, a few hours later, they brought me a desk and found a chair from somewhere, and I cracked on. Um, but so that was on the corporate floor, and I did a lot initially with the tax team, which was very
Mm.
interesting, but incredibly, like I couldn't really put it into context for myself. It was very niche, if you like.
Right.
But there was a fantastic tax partner who was very well known, and I was working with her a lot. And then I moved to supposedly the toughest seat. The trainee who was in there before was literally in tears every day. It was insurance and shipping insurance, I think it was. And they were like, Natalie, look, we know you can handle these really tricky partners. So that's your next seat. And I was like, oh, great. That's the next 6 months of joy I have to look forward to. And actually, the tricky partner, and it became a theme when I now look back in my career, that I have
Yeah.
found it quite easy to work with supposedly difficult people. And there's a whole bunch of
Mm.
reasons for that. But anyway, just back to the training contract. So I got on fine with this very difficult partner who was actually based in the Dubai office at the time. And there was another one in London. And I did my 6 months there, but I knew I didn't want to qualify into that. Then I moved into shipping litigation because I always imagined I'd be a shipping lawyer. That was one of the reasons I applied to Clyde & Co. Until I did shipping litigation, I realized that's exactly what I didn't want to do. And the court work was for me, it was just too scheduled. In those days, you had 14 days to, put your claim in, another 14 or 20, it was very prescribed. I enjoyed the court work, actually going to court and going into chambers and things like that. But actually on a day-to-day basis, I didn't really want to do it. But I had a fantastic time in that seat. And I still, to this day, in fact, the book that I've just published, I had a book launch and those partners were invited and came to the book launch. So I've kept a really good rapport with them. But I started getting interested in energy. And I think some of that might have been to do with the fact that I'm half Arabic. I grew up in the Middle East. Obviously, oil, gas is a big thing out there.
Yeah.
And I moved into the energy and project finance team at Clyde & Co. as my fourth seat. And I really loved it. And we did some really interesting stuff. We were advising on a CHP plant for Woking Borough Council at the time, which no one had really heard of. No one really knew how to do it. So it was sort of learning at the very nascent stages of some of these now renewable and low carbon alternatives. But I really enjoyed that, and I qualified into that seat in the end, and that was, I qualified September 2000.
Wow, that's incredible. And I think that, goes to show that it's so important to have an open mind because you may think that this is what you want to go into, and then you actually do it and you think, no. And
Yeah.
something you thought you may hate, you actually end up loving. So it can definitely go, both ways. And I think that's really important to remember when you sort
Yeah.
of start your training. And your experience in the energy sector has been incredible. You've worked across so many different firms. But starting sort of at that point where you qualified at Clyde & Co and you were doing sort of the energy work, when did you sort of decide that actually it was time for you to sort of move in-house as opposed to working in private practice? Why did that decision sort of come
Yeah,
about?
so again, there was a bit of a journey. So I left Clyde & Co. a few months after I qualified because I was totally sucked in by the money of a Wall Street law firm. So at that time, a lot of the New York law firms were opening branches in London, and they were offering newly qualified, treble their salary. It was all wonderful. And of course, bright lights, big city, dollar signs, as a young lawyer, I was like, yeah, I've got, mortgages or rents to pay and bills to pay. I'm moving.
Yeah.
So I did. I joined the oldest Wall Street firm in their London branch. And it was 3 years of hell, frankly. I didn't really enjoy the work. I was working incredibly long hours. I was working at least one day each weekend. And in those days, you didn't really have so much remote working. You'd have to go into the office and
Into the
sit
office.
in a, stale room for the entire day when all of your mates were out having fun. And that was really in my mid-20s. And I think I probably experienced what I now would recognize as a sort of burnout. And I was actually but the reason I explain all of this is at that time I was seconded also for a few months to an energy trading company. They were called Aquila Energy. And I absolutely loved that experience because we were lawyers, but we were sort of slightly off the trading floor, but they were traders coming in from morning to evening, being quite, Wolf of Wall Street. And they were really
Yeah.
fun characters back in those days. And I remember sitting there at my desk as a secondee to this trading company thinking, oh my God, this is what law is about. This is this is interesting. This is fun,
Yeah.
And so when I was back at Clyde & Co., so after I was at this Wall Street firm, I was asked back to Clyde & Co., luckily, back into the old team that I left. And I stayed there for about 2.5 years and remembered really all the reasons I wanted to leave in the first place, frankly. And I thought, I actually think being in-house is what I want to do. So let me give it a go. And I applied to Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan at the time. and I took on the JP Morgan offer. Both offered me, but I took on JP Morgan specifically because they were setting up and building out their energy and commodities business for Europe. And that was
Right.
in 2006. Morgan Stanley was more established. And I thought, right, if I'm going to learn about this business and this industry, I want to learn
Yeah.
it from literally building brick up. And that's what I did for the next 6 years.
Now changing jobs and moving has become even more common, but I think even maybe 10, 20 years ago, and I remember, my dad's sort of been working amongst the same time frame. I think he used to say that it was actually a lot more uncommon back then, whereas now it's not really frowned upon, and it's something
Yeah.
that is encouraged because you can experience different work cultures and you can see how different companies operate and what works best for you. But I guess for you at the time, did you notice any cultural shifts between when you were at Clyde and Co versus working at JP Morgan, or did you feel like in on some level perhaps the corporate structure was pretty much the same?
I mean, it was different in the sense that JP Morgan was just huge, massive top, investment bank.
Yeah.
So it was different. And obviously, in a bank, it's far more regulated in some ways. I mean, being in a law firm is regulated to an extent, but with banking, it's a different type of regulation. And I joined them
Yeah.
before the Lehman crisis
Right.
erupted, a couple of years before that. So, it was regulated then. Post Lehman, it was even more regulated. But frankly, for me, it was a lot more fun being in industry. And I think as a lawyer, you really tend to be either private practice mentality or in-house industry mentality. And I definitely was the latter. And I
Mm.
enjoyed being in a building with commercial folk, with traders, with credit people, with regulatory people, with structurers, with risk management, because for me, I guess I was able to really see the whole picture suddenly, in
Mm.
private practice. What I found, and I used to describe this as, you're almost the service staff at a massive banquet. So you're chopping up the vegetables, you're dicing the onions, you're serving the bigwigs at the table. And then
Yeah.
at the end of this banquet, you're in the kitchens cleaning up. And that's basically what you do in private practice from my
Mm.
perspective and my experience. Whereas
Mm.
in-house, you tend to get to hear about the deal before anything really happens, because you're already in those discussions where they're like, okay, look, next on the strategy is we're looking at this, whether it's a new country entry, it's a new product they want to trade, it's a new system they want to put in place. And you see it really before the final decision phase of, yes, we're even going ahead. In
Right.
private practice, I found very much you were involved, from my perspective, again, on a chunk of that whole process. So once I was in a company and you really have only one client, you
Yeah.
are really from the entire stage through. And again, you're in those discussions with the key stakeholders within the company. So for me, it just made it far more colorful, more creative in some ways, and you felt like you're right at the heart of it all, which for me was far more exciting.
Yeah, I love that analogy. I feel like I've never really heard that before, but that actually makes so much
Yeah.
sense. And the other thing I think I've always heard from those who decide to go in-house, a couple of years after private practice, is that idea of like when you're in private practice, sometimes you feel like you are the main character in a deal, like the law firm is the only thing that matters. But actually, when you go in-house, you realize you're just a small part of everything else that has to happen and take
Yeah,
place in order for something to go through. And that's actually a really interesting insight because you also don't just work with lawyers predominantly, but you actually work more so with non-lawyers, which is, because you learn so much about other industries as you go along as well, which I think
definitely.
for law, which sometimes can seem a bit like a bubble, it really helps to break that because you actually see how other people, work and outside the legal industry, which is definitely useful for sure. And in your, your kind of your experience, obviously you then continue to move in-house to other sort of companies focused on energy from BP to others. What have you noticed in terms of changes within the energy sector? So obviously in the last, I guess, 25 years, it's become a much bigger conversation than it was at the time. And I guess in your roles, how have you sort of seen those changes take place as you've moved through the industry?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Like I was sort of saying a little bit before, I entered the energy industry when there was, relatively less regulation. So we were
Yeah.
before the Enron. I was working on the fallout of Enron as well, which was the massive news at the time.
Right, yes.
So it's showing my age a bit, but that was a really interesting time and a wake-up call for the trading industry, particularly. So a lot more restrictions came into place. Things were done in a different way. Emphasis in contracts was in different areas to what they had been before. A lot of times people say, God, it was so much more fun being in the energy industry before all of these regulations. And that is absolutely true. I agree with that 100%. But the regulations are there for a reason. So
Mm.
post Enron, then comes the Lehman crisis when I was in a US investment bank. And in fact, actually, our JP Morgan's offices moved, I believe, to the Lehman's building in Canary Wharf from the city where I was with them. And so that was interesting moving into that building, which I think they
Not
finished.
a bad omen or
Yeah,
anything. Yeah.
decorated, the whole shebang.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful
Yeah.
building, actually, I have to say. But so again, of course, that came with, being in a bank, that came with another layer of regulations. So I
Yeah.
think it's definitely made risk appetites a bit tighter. Um,
Mm.
it's definitely made things a bit more complicated, harder sometimes to get deals across the line. I saw that, at JP Morgan, but also at BP as well. But and of course, the obvious thing is the energy transition, so moving
Yeah.
away from fossil fuels and moving into renewables. And again, that comes with, it's all great on paper, but actually, I think it's going to take a little longer to get us to the stage everyone wants us to be at, for many reasons. So there's been a lot of change, environmentally, with activism as well in this space. You're
Yeah.
now seeing it again in the mining industry, which is very similar to the extractive industries of oil and gas.
Yeah.
So I think it's just become a tougher market. But I think that
Mm.
probably goes across the board, not just in the energy space.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so much political, social, economic discussion about all of these, and I guess there are so many different stakeholders. But I guess from a UK perspective, we see everything, like we see the COP summits and we see countries coming together and making pledges, and then on the other hand, actually you see that pledges have been made, but how far that's been adhered to is a entirely different question, and then there's back and forth depending on whoever's in government in the West versus other countries. I guess from your perspective as a lawyer, having worked in so many of these different companies which have actually had both oil and gas, and still continue to, but are looking at renewables. I guess what's your perspective on how quickly we are moving and how much people do care? How much of it do you think is performative versus, what's happening on the ground?
Yeah, and that's another good question. I think it's depends who you speak to. I mean, let's look at the US as well. Trump is very clear, drill baby drill, and I can see where he's coming from to an extent on that.
Mm,
Because yes, it does generate profits. BP
yeah,
had the same issue. They made a massive um, pitch, if you like, to reinvent themselves and become this sort of renewables, big renewables player. But actually, on a day-to-day basis, it can't actually work
yeah.
operationally. And shareholders were just saying, look, we need our dividends, we need the shareholding price to go up. This is not what we want the company to be doing.
Mm,
So, and as I'm sure there's such a mix in energy as to, we still do need oil and gas to an extent.
yeah.
And that is what's going to be helping drive forward the renewables side of things, which of course we do need to get to. I mean, I think that's very
Mm,
clear for climate change. But,
yeah.
I think people were a little bit too optimistic to start with. And I think
Yeah.
reality has sort of kicked in for a lot of companies. Now, that doesn't mean that companies are not going to be doing renewables. I mean, Shell was way ahead of the curve for many years. So they are still investing, for example, a lot in their renewables, and so are
Yeah.
other companies. But it's a little tougher to, if you like, make profits from it. So you always, companies like that will always have their shareholders to answer to.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I think there's so much more nuance on that debate, and obviously with social media and opinions, everything has to be black or white. But nothing ever really is, and I think that's so important to recognize. And whilst these companies have really large resources and ability, they also are answerable to their shareholders, and I think that is always a it's a constant balance for sure. And I think it's important to remember that when you, whatever perspective you're looking at it from. In terms of your role, I think having seen all the changes within the energy industry, as well as all the political and debates and all that kind of stuff, what would you say have been the most sort of rewarding aspects of your role, things you've seen that have made you really proud, and what continues to be a real challenge?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if I look back, there's a thread that goes through of, what's made me proud, and that is actually working with fantastic teams,
Yeah.
working with intelligent people, working on really, cutting edge deals in the industry. There are two or three I can think of that were just really fantastic to be on. They were a lot of effort. They were very difficult and complex in lots of ways. Sometimes they were the toughest negotiations because we just had really, really difficult companies sitting on the other side of the boardroom table. But they were the most rewarding because we got those deals over the line, and we did them at a time that was, probably, quite risky, and in a very short space of time. So I have definitely stayed in the office, through to the next afternoon, no sleep, just working on documents. And that was in-house, not just in private practice. But those were the rare occasions. So because they're rare, you're not as
Yeah.
averse to doing them. If that was,
Yeah.
constant, then you wouldn't survive, I don't think. So for me, it was really working with good teams and feeling part of the team's success as well, so that they could deliver on their strategy. I think what continues to be a big challenge, and I actually write about this in my book, How to Navigate Your Career Like a Legend, is, and this is going to sound like quite a strange thing to say, but the challenge for me, again, looking back over the years, has been navigating other people's insecurities. So when it boils down to a personal issue, is sometimes much more difficult to deal with than, say, like a regulatory or legal change, or a tough deal. I always found some characters, you had to really be very careful around how you manage them, not just talking about other people's insecurities and how that can have a really toxic impact on work environments, on people and on people's daily lives. But also, we all have insecurities. How do you deal with them and manage them to ensure that they don't become an issue either to you or to the people around you? And in fact, how do you better yourself working with those insecurities, to make yourself, a better professional, but also a better person? And so I think that's an ongoing challenge because it's human nature. Which takes longer to change.
It's a perfect segue because I was actually going to ask you about your book next. You've just hinted at it, but was there sort of like a moment or an interaction which made you think, actually, you know what, it's time to like talk about this and really put this at the fore? And, was that like a moment where you just thought, that's it, it's got to go out?
Yeah, but it wasn't because of one incident. It was a kind of a chain of things that happened. And the first, it started actually as just an article I wrote and got published in the Lawyer magazine. And I just posted it, I think, on my LinkedIn as well. And the amount of feedback and people wanting to connect and reposts and shares was unbelievable. And it was all about Queen Bee syndrome. And I was in two minds. It was interesting because I was advised by a couple of people, look, don't publish that article, Natalie. It's true, but it may not serve you, and people may not like it. And I thought, you know what? If it's hitting a nerve, that means there's going to be resonance out there. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to publish it because it's my truth, as people like to say, these days.
Yeah.
And it turns out it's a lot of other people's truths and experiences, and it's all about how you deal with difficult female leaders. And it's really, so the book kind of came about from the response I had on that first article. And I'd written a couple of other articles, and I thought, you know what, why don't I actually put this into a book? Because it's the book I wish I had at the start of my career, and throughout my career as I got to leadership positions, because I also talk about how as a leader, you can look out for certain bad behaviors in your team and what you should be aware of and how you can maybe better, your team's lives, if you like, on a day-to-day basis. So there are 12 chapters, each dealing with completely different topics in the workplace. So it can be, as I've mentioned, the insecurities, dealing with Queen Bee, dealing, how to, praising men who help women in the workplace, praising women who help women in the workplace. Having been in trading, we're always talked about as the cowboys and that they're so rogue, rogue traders, but actually traders, in my experience, have been some of the smartest people I've ever worked with, and they don't want to do the wrong thing generally, so it's how do you keep those kind of businesses well within, the ethical framework, and feel actually that you can hold your head high as the lawyer, making sure that they're in check, but not being sort of the schoolmistress, but sort of working very closely with them to make sure you're keeping them on the right side of the law. Everything is grey in commodities trading. We're constantly dealing with risk, but actually experience shows you what is a real risk and what is not actually a risk. So I touch on lots of different topics, and one of them is also dealing with loss in the workplace. How do you do that as an employee, and how is it best to deal with your employees as, the leader of the team when they're facing, whether it's a divorce or loss of a family member or friend or whatever that might be. And each chapter is also illustrated because I do quite a lot of my own ink drawings. And so just to make it slightly more lighthearted, although it deals with important topics, I've got a few, 12 tongue-in-cheek illustrations that kind of encapsulate the chapter. And there's also some dedicated journaling pages too. So I really wanted it to be a kind of living and breathing guide and companion, if you like, that people can dip in and out of. Or read all the way, straight through.
I was doing a bit of a deep dive into it yesterday, and so many of the reviews were talking about that. I think the biggest one, which you said at the start, was it was so resonating that they could really, they could kind of see a lot of the experiences and connect with it on a part, which is, upsetting because obviously those are experiences that are negative experiences. But I think so many people could, kind of resonate with it, which shows you that it's clearly not a small minority problem. It's something that a lot of people are facing. But I think equally, like you said, we don't talk enough about these things because we don't get taught about it at school. And you don't really get taught about it at law school either. You get taught how to be a lawyer, but not how to deal with, being in a workplace when you are a lawyer, which is, if not more, but just as important. And I think that your kind of drawing the practical aspects, I think all of that kind of came together so well. In terms of the writing process for you and, kind of putting it together, I guess for you, was it sort of, therapeutic in that own sense of putting it down? Sort of what were your feelings as you were writing the book?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I was, it felt like a really cathartic experience.
Yeah, I can imagine.
One about Queen Bee. I mean, I typed that thing out really quickly because I was like, and another thing, and another thing. This is actually how I wish somebody had spoken to me to help me actually navigate some of these tricky women in the workplace. And so a lot of it is really the aim, and you were sort of mentioning it a bit earlier, is that it does happen to a lot of people. So one of the aims of this book was, I don't want other people to feel alone, because there are a lot of times I just think, is it just me? Is it something I've done? I take it very personally, which I think is very natural. But when you realize these are games people play, you can really start to step back and actually add more value to yourself and go, actually, I can see straight through that behavior. And I, for example, there were a couple of female leaders that I remember thinking, when I'm a leader, I am never going to make somebody feel the way you've made me feel or the way you've made my colleague feel, or, so actually you learn from the bad behaviors more than you learn from the good behaviors, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, it was really lovely to be able to sort of get it all out on paper.
Yeah, I could definitely imagine. And I guess, I really hope everyone goes and grabs a copy. We'll obviously put links down below and everything. But for those who either haven't managed to grab a copy or maybe, don't have the chance to after this, I guess from your book, if you could take one piece of advice you've given in there that you want to give to every female leader or male leader out there who are leading a team, and particularly, more junior members of the team who've just kind of begun their journey in the profession, what would you say to them which will help the people in their team thrive and not feel like they're being belittled?
I would say make sure you're looking out for your team. I think it's very easy to and especially in law firms, you're not taught how to be a manager or a leader in a law firm. That's, I've noticed more happens in
Yeah.
companies. For
Yeah,
some reason,
definitely.
as a lawyer, I guess you're trained to just do the law, do as good a job as you can, deliver to your client, and that's really your job. But actually, as far as managing people and leading people, that's not in my day, was not on the curricula, if you like. So I think for leaders, and this I've seen from some very good leaders in companies, and actually there are a handful in private practice who were good too. I hate to say it, they were mostly men in my experience. But they would really look out for their team members and make sure, whenever I've led a team, that it's very clear I've got their backs and there's a two-way communication here. There should be no blockages, because you need to be able to understand your team to help motivate them, to help give them the right piece of work, the right guidance, and really help them build up their careers.
And I guess if you could say one thing, to yourself 25 years ago when you started, and you were you'd never been in that workplace and it was the start of your journey, what would you say to that young Natalie?
I'd say it's not you, it's them.
Yeah. I love that.
It's the kind of, don't take things so personally. I think men generally tend to be much better at this than women. I hate to say, we as women tend to really internalize things. And men tend to be able to, and I talk about it in my book a bit, to shake things off, as Taylor Swift would say. They're generally natural networkers compared to women. I think women are good in certain groups, but actually it's not a natural thing necessarily for women in the workplace. I know this goes back to centuries of really the workplace being built for men, not women.
Yeah.
And we're relatively new into all of this. So yeah, I would say, don't take things as personally, because there are games being played.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that imposter syndrome kicks in so quickly for women, even more so than men, I think. And it seems to be, like you say, it's kind of a conditioning that's just happened over such a long period of time, and it's going to take a while to sort of unlearn that in a way, because it's those like behavioral patterns. But I think as women continue to, thrive and dominate the workplace, I think it's important for us to definitely start doing that. And the more people like you and leaders talk about it, I think, hopefully we're on our way to getting there for sure. We always end with a quick rapid fire at the end. So just to find the three questions to finish us off.
Yeah.
I've already asked you about the best advice. So I guess the first question is, what's the worst piece of advice you've ever received that you just wouldn't want anyone else to receive as well?
It's very specific to me. When I was applying to university, I had the head of I was at a boarding school, and the head of the house that I was in just said, Natalie, don't apply to Oxbridge because you won't be able to take the rejection. So just take that off your form. And I thought, really? I'm now definitely going to apply just to show you that I'm going to do it anyway. And it turned out, this is again going back to don't take it personally, it turned out that she got rejected from Oxford. So that's why, anyway, I didn't, and I went on and enjoyed my time there. But so there's always a reason why somebody's, people come from different motivating perspectives.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say it was some sort of like reverse psychology of like
Yeah.
not telling you to do it would make you do it sort of thing. But yeah, and that insecurity aspect of it is also so important, which is why it's important to know the biases that people have before you take on any advice, for sure. The next question is, if you could have dinner with a legend of your choice, who do you think it would be? And it could be dead or alive, up to you.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I would love to have pretty much all of them. I was going to say Elvis Presley just because I found him incredibly good looking, but I think I wouldn't really listen to what he was saying. I'd just be looking at him and hopefully he'd be singing to me. But I thought, okay, if it's not Elvis, who could it be? I would choose Elizabeth Taylor, because I think she had an amazing life. She was an incredible human being. She did so much charitable work and raised some very sensitive issues. I remember at the time with AIDS, I lived through the period where people thought you could catch AIDS from just touching someone's hand. And she did a lot for HIV in those days when no other famous person did. Princess Diana did, but she was one of the very few. And I think she just would have been a great person to listen to some of the gossip of the golden age of Hollywood as well.
Yeah. I'd love to hear her take on Taylor Swift's song of Her and what she
Yeah.
thought about it. But no, for sure. Yeah, an incredible legend. And final question is, what are the top three travel destinations on your bucket list?
I've been very lucky because I've been able to travel pretty much to all the places I would have always wanted to, but there's still three remaining, and that's Copenhagen, Japan, and Mexico.
Oh, lovely. Well, went to Copenhagen last year. I would highly recommend. It was
Oh,
beautiful.
right.
The other
Map
two are also on my bucket
Good.
list. Amazing. Well, on that note, Natalie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was such an interesting conversation. I feel like we covered such a range of topics. And I think I could tell that the thing that we kept coming back to was the importance of people and working with the right people and ensuring that we're training the next set of leaders to be, kind of helping other people and our younger people in their team thrive as opposed to that thing you mentioned about Queen Bee syndrome. So I think that your book and everything that you're doing is incredibly inspiring.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
And on that note, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and a massive shout out to Natalie for coming on Commerce Meets Law. It was really a conversation that we hadn't had on the podcast before, and a space that we haven't really explored within commercial law. So if you enjoyed this episode and want more episodes with people from either the energy space or other sectors, please do let me know by emailing commercemeetslaw@gmail.com or with a DM on Instagram at Commerce Meets Law. And you can also reach out to us on our website, which will be linked down in the description. And also, we will link down in the description, as I mentioned in the intro, the link to Natalie's book. So if you enjoyed the conversation, please do check it out. Finally, for extra CML content, do check out the Commerce Meets Law YouTube channel and our TikTok. For now, take care, goodbye, and I'll see you very soon on the next episode.